It is the 14th of April, 1943, and a Wellington bomber is coming apart over the Dutch coast. Flak has found the port engine, and the aircraft is losing height fast, the crew fighting to hold a straight line long enough for everyone to get out. One by one, parachutes bloom against the night sky, drifting down towards fields that belong, for now, to Nazi Germany. Within hours, the survivors will be picked up, searched, stripped of everything that might help them, and marched towards a prisoner of war camp. A guard runs his hands over a young navigator's tunic, checking seams, pockets, the lining of the collar. He finds nothing of interest. The uniform looks entirely ordinary, but sewn onto the front of that tunic is a button, one among many, identical in every visible respect to its neighbors, and inside that button is a compass. Small enough to vanish under a fingernail, precise enough to guide a man 300 miles across occupied territory, and hidden well enough that thousands of German searches never found it. This is the story of that button, and of the strange, secretive corner of British intelligence that dreamed it up. It is not a story of tanks or bombers or the great set-piece battles that usually fill the history books. It is a story about something much smaller and, in its own way, far stranger. The idea that a single soldier, alone and unarmed behind enemy lines, could carry his own means of escape sewn into his clothing without anyone, friend or foe, ever noticing. That idea would help tens of thousands of men find their way home, and it would do so through nothing more dramatic than a tiny magnetized needle and a button that unscrewed the wrong way. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what happened to a man the moment he was captured. Everything of value was taken from him immediately. Money, tools, maps, anything metal that might be useful, all confiscated within minutes of capture, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. For a man trying to plan an escape, this was the first and most brutal obstacle. Without a map, he did not know where he was. Without money, he could not buy food or a train ticket. And without a compass, even a man who broke free of a camp at night, in the dark, with dogs and searchlights behind him, had no reliable way of knowing which direction led to freedom and which led straight back into German-held territory. Escape without navigation was not really escape at all. It was simply delaying recapture by a few cold, hungry, disorientated hours. By the early years of the war, this problem had become urgent. France had fallen in the summer of 1940, and with it went the network of escape lines that aircrew might once have relied upon on the near side of the Channel. Bomber Command and Fighter Command were sending young men over enemy territory night after night, and a steady trickle of them were being shot down, bailing out or crash-landing in fields from Norway to the Balkans. Some evaded capture entirely, helped along by resistance networks willing to risk everything to move a stranded airman down a chain of safe houses towards neutral Spain or Switzerland. Many more were captured within days, exhausted, hungry, and without the faintest idea which way led to safety. Some simply gave themselves up rather than wander blind through unfamiliar countryside, reasoning that a prison camp was preferable to starving in a hedgerow with no idea whether the next village held friends or informers. The existing solutions were hopeless. A standard military compass was bulky, made of brass and glass, housed in a case designed for a man's hand rather than a man's secret, and impossible to conceal from even a cursory search. Anything that looked remotely like a navigational instrument was confiscated on sight, along with money, penknives, and anything else that might extend a prisoner's usefulness to himself. Some early improvised attempts at concealment were crude and easily discovered, hidden in linings that any competent guard would think to check within the first minute of a search. What was needed was not a better compass in the conventional sense, not a more accurate needle or a sturdier case. What was needed was a compass that did not look like a compass at all, one that could survive a search not because it was well hidden in the ordinary sense, but because the searcher had no reason to suspect the object in front of him was anything other than what it appeared to be. That distinction, between hiding something and disguising it as something else entirely, was the conceptual leap that MI9 would eventually have to make, and it was a leap that no existing piece of military equipment had ever been designed to accommodate. The man given responsibility for solving this problem was Christopher Clayton Hutton, a former Royal Flying Corps pilot turned film industry publicist, working out of a new and deliberately obscure branch of military intelligence known as MI9. Established in December 1939, MI9's job was to help Allied servicemen escape capture and find their way home, and its guiding philosophy, in the words of the men who ran it, was simple. An escaper needed a map, a compass, and food, and if the department could put all three into his hands before he was ever shot down, his odds improved enormously. Hutton, known to colleagues by the nickname Clutty, had a gift for looking at an ordinary object and seeing an opportunity. Colleagues later described him as possessing a kind of tempestuous brilliance, equal parts inventive genius and sheer bloody-mindedness, and he needed both because the instrument-making establishment was not initially interested in helping him. Hutton approached several of Britain's most respected compass and instrument manufacturers with his request. "Build me a compass small enough to hide inside a uniform button." Every one of them turned him down. The tolerances required were beyond what their production lines were set up to manage, or they simply could not shift their work fast enough to satisfy the urgency of the request. Eventually, Hutton found his manufacturer not among the great names of British instrument making, but in a small workshop in London called Blunt Brothers, which had the precision machining capability and the laboratory space to attempt something genuinely miniature. Working together, Hutton and the team at Blunt Brothers produced a magnetized needle mounted on a tiny pivot, no larger than the head of a drawing pin, sensitive enough to swing reliably towards magnetic north even when jostled inside a man's pocket for days on end. The genius of the design was not really in the compass itself, elegant as it was. It was in the concealment. The needle was fitted into the back of an ordinary military uniform button, the kind sewn in rows down the front of an RAF tunic, indistinguishable at a glance from every other button on the garment. To reveal the compass, the wearer simply unscrewed the button, and here Hutton added the touch that turned a clever gadget into something close to sabotage of the searcher's own instincts. The thread was reversed. A German guard, trying to unscrew a suspicious-looking button in the ordinary way, would in fact be tightening it further and would give up none the wiser. Later batches went further still, replacing the visible screw thread entirely with a seamless join so that no search, however thorough, would find a seam to prise open in the first place. When the enemy did eventually catch on to the trick, MI9 simply moved the compass elsewhere, into collar studs, pencil clips, cufflinks, and the metal tips of shoelaces, into razor blades magnetized so precisely that the letter G on a Gillette blade always pointed north when the blade was suspended on a thread. Between 1942 and 1945, MI9 organized the production and distribution of more than 1,300,000 of these small brass compasses in various disguised forms, alongside roughly 1.5 million escape maps printed on silk and tissue so they could be folded into impossibly small spaces, and thousands of pairs of flying boots engineered to be quietly converted into plain civilian shoes with a few cuts of a hidden blade. Exact production figures for individual variants remain difficult to pin down with certainty, since much of the paperwork was destroyed or never fully declassified, but the scale of the operation, running across multiple workshops and involving specialist manufacturers producing outer button shells that looked identical to standard military issue, was industrial in every sense but its total secrecy. To keep the whole scheme hidden, Hutton insisted on a strict compartmentalization of labor that would not have looked out of place on a modern intelligence operation. The workshop responsible for the tiny magnetized rotor knew nothing of where the finished compasses would end up. The button manufacturers, established firms such as Firmin of London and Birmingham Buttons, supplied outer shells indistinguishable from ordinary uniform buttons and had no reason to suspect that a small fraction of their output was being quietly fitted with a working compass elsewhere. Even within MY9 itself, knowledge of the full manufacturing chain was kept to a small circle, on the reasoning that a secret known to fewer people was a secret far less likely to leak to the enemy through a captured document or a careless conversation. It was, in effect, a small wartime factory system built entirely around the principle that no single worker should be able to describe the finished product. The compass mechanism itself, though tiny, had to meet a demanding specification. It needed to sit inside a button roughly the diameter of a shilling, no more than a few millimeters deep, while still swinging freely and settling accurately enough to be trusted with a man's life. The magnetized needle, often shaped as a small four-pointed rotor rather than a conventional pointer, sat on a fine pivot, protected by a thin disc of glass or mica, no thicker than a fingernail, with north marked in luminous paint so it could be read in total darkness without a torch that might give away a man's position. To grasp the scale involved, imagine trying to fit a working watch mechanism inside a coat button and still expect it to survive months in a man's pocket, through rain, mud, and the general punishment of a body constantly on the move. That was, in essence, the engineering problem Hutton and Blunt brothers solved, and they solved it using little more than a small London workshop, a handful of skilled instrument makers, and an enormous amount of trial and error. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Getting these devices into the hands of the men who needed them was itself a small miracle of quiet organization. Every RAF aircrew member setting out on a mission over occupied Europe carried at least one concealed compass sewn into a uniform button, buckle, or collar stud, alongside silk maps hidden in the lining of flying boots or the seams of battle dress. For the men shot down and taken prisoner, further compasses and maps were smuggled into camps through an elaborate deception involving fictitious charities and doctored parcels of games, playing cards, and clothing, all passed as innocent Red Cross comforts under the noses of camp censors. Prisoners preparing for the famous escape from Stalag Luft III in March 1944, the operation later dramatized as the Great Escape, relied in part on concealed compasses and forged papers that had reached them through exactly this kind of covert supply chain. Precise numbers of how many individual escapes succeeded purely because of a hidden button compass are, by the nature of the thing, almost impossible to establish. Records are patchy, many escape attempts went undocumented in detail, and the men involved had every reason at the time to keep quiet about exactly how they had done it. What can be said with confidence is that MI9's methods, taken together, are credited with helping something in the region of 35,000 Allied servicemen make their way back to friendly territory over the course of the war, a figure that would have been unthinkable without a reliable means of finding North in the dark, alone, with nothing else in your pockets. The psychological effect of these gadgets deserves its own mention. German search procedures were thorough by design, intended to strip a captured man of any hope of self-sufficiency, and the routine was meant to be demoralizing as much as practical, a deliberate demonstration to a newly captured man that he now had nothing and controlled nothing. The knowledge spread quietly among Allied aircrew before they ever set out on a mission, that a resourceful man might still be carrying a working compass through the middle of a full-body search, undermined that whole system of control in a way no single weapon could. It gave frightened young men something almost as valuable as the compass itself, the belief that capture was not necessarily the end of the story, that the war was not entirely over the moment a parachute opened over hostile ground. Escape and evasion training drilled this belief in deliberately, teaching aircrew not just how to use the hidden equipment, but how to think of themselves as still active participants in the war, even while sitting, apparently helpless, in an interrogation room. The Germans were not blind to any of this, and they developed their own escape and evasion equipment for downed Luftwaffe crews operating over Allied territory, though on a noticeably smaller and less systematic scale. German compasses of the period tended to be conventional pocket instruments rather than objects disguised as everyday items, reflecting a doctrine that placed less emphasis on the individual airman's capacity for prolonged solo evasion deep in hostile territory, since German aircrew were far more often operating closer to their own lines. The Americans, once the United States entered the war, studied MY9's work closely and eventually built their own equivalent organization, designated MIS-X, which adopted many of Hutton's concealment tricks wholesale, right down to compasses hidden in buttons and maps folded into playing cards. What set the British effort apart was less the underlying idea, since magnetized needles were hardly a new invention, and more the sheer inventive range Hutton and his team applied to the problem of concealment, treating almost any small object a man might plausibly carry, a pencil, a comb, a pipe, as a candidate for hiding a compass or a map, and doing so at a scale and pace no other nation matched during the war. Assessing the precise material impact of the button compass on the war's outcome is, honestly, an impossible task, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It did not sink a ship or shoot down an aircraft. Its effect was quieter and more personal, measured one escaper at a time, in the extra weeks a man survived on the run, in the difference between wandering in circles near a checkpoint and walking with purpose towards a border 200 kilometers away. Where the evidence is clearer is in the legacy of the idea itself. The principle behind the button compass, that ordinary objects can be quietly re-engineered to carry hidden capability, became a foundational concept in later escape and evasion equipment used by Western militaries throughout the Cold War and beyond, and modern descendants of Hutton's original design, produced by British instrument makers such as Francis Barker, remain in use in survival kits today, essentially unchanged in principle after more than 80 years. Surviving examples of the original wartime compasses can be seen in museum collections, including the Imperial War Museum in London and the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, small brass discs behind glass that give almost no hint until you read the label of what they were once capable of doing for the man who carried one. Return, for a moment, to that Dutch field in April 1943, to the young navigator standing in the dark while a guard's hands move over his tunic, feeling for anything that does not belong. The guard finds a button. He moves on. That is the whole story, really, compressed into a single unremarkable second, a search that finds nothing because the thing being searched for was never meant to be found by looking, only by knowing exactly where to look and how the world's ordinary objects might be turned against the people using them. What Clayton Hutton and the team at Blunt Brothers built was not, in the end, a compass. Compasses had existed for centuries. What they built was a piece of psychological engineering disguised as a piece of mechanical engineering, an object that worked precisely because everyone who saw it, guards, interrogators, camp commandants, looked straight through it without a second thought. Consider what that button actually achieved. It gave a downed airman, stripped of every conventional resource, one working tool that no search could reliably take from him. It turned a piece of standard military uniform, something so mundane that no regulation could remove it without leaving a man half-dressed, into a lifeline. It exploited, with a kind of dry mischievousness entirely characteristic of its inventor, the very thoroughness of the German search procedure, tightening under the fingers of the man trying hardest to defeat it. And it did all of this at a scale of well over 1 million units, manufactured under total secrecy, distributed to aircrew across every theater in which the RAF operated, without a single German intelligence report ever fully cracking the scheme before the war's end. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that none of this required a single new scientific principle. Magnetized needles, reversed screw threads, buttons, every individual component of the button compass had existed for decades, sometimes centuries, before Hutton put them together. The innovation was entirely in the combination, in the willingness to treat a soldier's own uniform as a piece of secret equipment, and in the discipline to keep that secret for years, while the devices moved by the hundreds of thousands through the supply chains of an air force at war. It is, in its way, one of the purest examples in military history of an idea succeeding not through force or scale, but through the simple, unglamorous act of not being noticed. Thousands of men who might otherwise have spent the remainder of the war behind barbed wire instead made it home, in no small part because a button on their tunic pointed quietly north. No explosion marked their escape. No headline recorded it. Most of them, questioned decades later, could barely explain how the compass worked, only that it had, at the moment it mattered most, told them which way to run. That is the entire legacy of the button compass, distilled into a single sentence. The smallest, quietest objects sometimes carry the largest consequences, hidden in plain sight, waiting only for someone desperate enough and lucky enough to unscrew the wrong way and find their way home.